Hi everyone, I'm Izzy and I'm joined today by Dtro of the University of California, Irvine. Dtro, how are you?
Good, good. Yeah, doing well. How about you?
I'm wonderful. So, you've been in the scene for a couple of years in CELO. Kind of introduce yourself and your competitive experience.
Yeah, so I got into UCI, and at the time it was like 2018, and UCI was this crazy school for esports, right? Like that was their niche. And so I went like kind of like thinking, "Oh, that's cool. Like I could never." And my second year, cuz at the time everyone was like challenger on the squad, and I was like, "Well, what if I started pushing for that?"
Hmm.
And so I started training the head coach Hermes. I actually reached out to him and I was like, "Hey, like what can I do to start improving for this?" And I did that for about a year, right? So during my sophomore year, I'm kind of practicing, I'm training, doing VOD reviews, looking at all sorts of things. And I go to try out and I get like absolutely smashed. Like it's not even close. And so you kind of take a while to recover from that. And it's like, okay, well, what can I do with this? So I start reaching out to like the people I tried out with. So some former like legends were at the tryouts. Like a couple of them were like Jeffrey and Youngbin, who had won collegiate in like 2018,
Yeah.
2017. And so they were really good resources. And so they helped me out. People wanted to see me grow, and if it seems like if you ask for help, people will help you, and that's always been like a really positive experience at UCI. And so another 6 months of that, and I eventually made like a sub position, and then I got moved up to JV. And so when I was on JV, I think I stayed on JV until I graduated in 2022. And so when I was on JV in like the earlier times, like I was competing with the other support. His name was Kim Down. And so I spent a lot of my UCI experience like with him as kind of like my rival, where we would every
Yeah.
trial we would kind of go head to head and be like a little bit better each time. And at the final tryout, you know, um, I sat down with Hermes and I'm like, "Yo, so like how'd I do?" Right? He's like, "Well, at this point, you're as good as Ethan, but because the program has had him longer, he gets the spot." And
Yeah.
that kind of stung, right? But it makes sense. Seniority is ultimately the thing that was the decider in the last tryout. But I was proud of myself. I had pushed, and then I had caught up to him, or sort of caught up to him, depending on who you ask. Um, but yeah, yeah, and so I just continued to compete on JV. Kind of right now, I'm kind of transitioning out, helping the new generation get acclimated. Because for like I've worked with Hermes for a while, and I know how he likes to coach and all that stuff. But yeah, that's a little bit about my competitive journey.
Yeah, so from that entire experience, you
Hmm.
really continue to push through and persevere
Yeah.
regardless of the result. What were some of the big technical takeaways that you reflected on as a player during that time?
So what are the takeaways that I just learned from grinding the game so much?
Yeah, like what when you look back at the type of player you were, what weren't you good
Mm.
at? What did you have to get better
Ah,
at? Yeah.
okay, that's a good question. So, if you recall, when I went to my first tryout, I got like demolished. I went like 1-8 or something on my first like on the tryout day, and so I was talking with Hermes about it the day after, and I was like, what could I have done? He's like, well, everything, like literally everything. And so that's a hard thing to hear because it's like, oh, I have to catch up in all these aspects, literally every aspect of the game, every single fundamental. And that's sort of daunting, right? But then the way he explained it and the way he started coaching, it was like, let's just talk about the first 5 minutes of the game. Let's talk about laning phase, and let's break laning phase down into trading and interactions and drafts, right? And so if you can kind of master like the first 5 minutes of a game, the first 5 minutes of like even before you get into the game, right? Like if you're sitting in loading screen and you can kind of form a framework of how you're going to play the game, right? It's like this is what's likely to happen in my matchup. This is what's gonna happen on the third wave, so and so, right? Then in that aspect, you can kind of start working at them in this manner. So first you master the first 5 minutes, and eventually I went to Hermes. Is like, I think I'm comfortable with the first 5 minutes. Let's move on. He's like, okay, let's talk about mid game. And so then you start getting into the harder stuff, which is like the stuff that is difficult knowledge to obtain. So within League, there are different types of knowledge, and some of them are easy to obtain. For instance, matchup knowledge, right? Google any champion, look up X, Y, and Z counters, and you'll get a pretty good idea, right? You'll get 80% of the picture,
Yeah.
right? Whereas with macro, it's difficult to learn this stuff if you don't have a resource for it. Or at least it was back when I started playing. Now it's a little bit better, but back then, like certain types of knowledge are more difficult to acquire than others. So that was something that I could only learn from someone who knew already. And so I would say going into it, right, I needed to work on everything. And the thing that I started picking up quicker was that macro aspect. The thing that and that eventually became like one of my strengths because Hermes has a very good brain for macro. And so at the end of my 2 years with him, I was pretty solid. We saw the game the same way. We saw how things should play out at a macro level. And the thing that I still, I guess, I would say I'm working on, or the thing that I could be improving on, is really just the mechanics, right? So at a certain point, right, if you're just an average person, you can learn the macro, and it's not hard to learn. You just have to know it. And then once you do that, though, it takes kind of like this, like mechanics is a harder thing to
Yeah.
improve because either you're gifted or you're not. And I would say, like, honestly speaking, I'm not that gifted at micro, but it is something that can be trained, right? And so if you really do want to compete at the highest level, you have to have both. You have to have a great head for macro, and you have to have gifted mechanics, right? And so to a certain extent, you can train these things. And I'm kind of on the fence about, like, is some of it like innate? Is some of it kind of like
Yeah.
God-given gifts, right? But I'm trying, and I
Yeah.
think that it's been a fun exercise seeing how far I can get. Because when I first started trying, people were like, "I don't think you'll ever match Ethan," and I think, or Kim Down,
Yeah.
and I think that I'm beginning to prove them wrong. I think that where I'm at is I wouldn't have expected it 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that is awesome. I can certainly say that I do not have that given talent for mechanics. I usually just mash my keyboard, so
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think
exactly,
you
right?
could train that out of me.
Mm,
You got to compete in the Proving Grounds Spring and then
mhm,
Unified Premier League throughout the rest of the year.
yeah.
So from finally getting to play in some games, and make your way onto that JV roster, how was that competition environment for you?
Well, actually, funny that you mentioned it. One of my tryouts was to play a Proving Grounds game. It was against Bay State. And so the sort of parameter Hermes gave me was that he told me, like, play perfect in this game and you can have the spot. And that's a tall order
Yeah,
because Bay State was and continues to be very, like, a very solid team.
yeah.
Like, I think they were semifinalists or finalists
They're
in the.
finalists.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So at the time, right, they were a strong opponent, and I had Hermes telling me, like, you have to play perfect. Because at the end of the day, right, Ethan had already played against this team on the first day and he did good, but he made mistake, right? He
Hmm.
didn't play perfect. So the only metric that I could have of beating him was to play perfect. And that's a tall ask. And I tried it, and I think the pressure got to me because I liked pressure, but like the expectation to play perfect, it's a lot,
Yeah,
even for me, right? And so I played good. I played memorably, but I didn't play perfect. And I guess that's the part that, I look back and that's what I think about.
yeah. How were you able to manage like the mental aspect of being up against that rivalry all those years at UCI?
It so I have a lot of like friends still on the team, and I give them a piece of advice, which is have something else, right? So like for a lot of players on the team, or for a lot of players who are good at this game, that's their thing. That's what they're good at, and there's not a lot of other things going for them, which is okay, right? It's totally okay to have your thing and excel at it. But the problem is when that thing is your whole life and it's not going well, then your life is not going well, right? So I think that something that really kept me going was the fact that I had fallback. Like, in essence, for me, league wasn't the end game
Yeah,
because right now, just a little bit about me, I'm applying to med school, and
yeah,
that's my end game, right? And so having that sort of like other aspirations and things outside of league that make it so that league doesn't consume my life, I think that really helped me because it's like at the end of the day, if league isn't going well, I will be okay.
yeah,
And that's an important thing for, I think, players to understand, right? Because you have these kids who are in college and league is their life and they're playing and they're good at it, which is great. But it's like, can you really sit there and grind league for 12 hours and tell me like you feel okay? Like
yeah.
that's the sort of piece of advice that I give my younger classmates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can kind of like relate to that from the perspective of being an amateur interview host is that like
Mhm,
I'm an
mhm.
engineer. I went to engineering school. So I can take these amateur jobs as I like improve
Yeah,
and support myself as an engineer. Whereas like I have friends where it's like this is all they do and they have the remaining few years to make it work or they just have to find something else.
sometimes you need that desperation, right?
Yeah,
Like the best players are kind of born out of that. It's this or nothing, right?
absolutely. I want to go back to we've talked about you competing on UCI.
Mhm.
how are you doing in solo queue? Like beyond UCI, and especially now that you're starting to like phase out of that team.
Yeah, you know what? So after leaving UCI, solo queue is really kind of the only avenue I can express, like myself as a league player. So I put a lot of effort into my solo queue ranking, and I think it reflects. I think I reached something like top 40-ish, top 40-ish. Yeah, recently, like a week ago, 2 weeks
Yeah,
ago. And I'm proud of that, because it's like on the one hand, everyone kind of memes about solo queue, doesn't matter that much. But on the other hand, it does take a certain amount of skill to be top 40,
yeah,
and I own that, and I'm proud of that. And I think that I guess the next step for me is to kind of prove myself in a different arena. Like, yeah, like you're top 40 in solo queue. What does that mean in a competitive environment? And that's kind of the reason I'm here, is that I want to find out, because this is actually the highest I've reached in my career ever. Like even when I was when I was at UCI, I was kind of like slowly climbing the ranks, but this is actually where I'm peaking. So I'm wondering, like, kind of the question I'm asking myself is, does it mean I'm peaking as a player? Does it mean that this will translate? I don't know. So I
yeah.
want to find out.
What are you looking for specifically in a team? Are you looking for amateur? Like, what kind of support are you looking for? You're looking to
hmm
start? Like, kind of describe some of that.
Yeah. So, like I said, I spent 2 years under Hermes, and that was great. And I really enjoyed my time there. And Hermes is a great person and a great coach. But one of the things I started noticing was, well, after a while, I learned a lot of what he had to say. And so things got a little bit repetitive when, like, say he's training new people, and of course
Yeah,
he has to teach them fundamentals, but I'm sitting here having learned them already, and I'm not getting much out of it, because necessarily we have to train the new generation, but also where does that leave me, right?
mm-hmm.
And so I think one of the things that I'm looking for is a different perspective. So I need coaches that are willing to argue with me and argue about my beliefs about the game, because I can't go through my career in league having this one perspective,
Yeah,
right? So in that sense, I feel that I've um, kind of maxed out on this resource of knowledge.
yeah,
Yeah. And of course, I'm grateful for that. And that's a good position to be in, where you understand someone's um you understand someone's basically conception of the game. That's a good position to be in.
yeah,
But at this point it's like, well, I think if I want to kind of break past this plateau, I have to find something else. I have to find someone who, through me, I can kind of put my old coach's ideas in conversation with someone new.
yeah,
And that's really the way the understanding is created, because then we can figure out, okay, let's get to the bottom of this. Who's right? Who's wrong?
yeah,
Right? And I've actually been doing that. I've been reaching out to coaches, I've been looking at FODs, I've been kind of just putting out feelers to see, like, hey, what do you think about my gameplay? Like, are we coming to the same conclusions? And I think that's an important process, especially in like the
yeah,
off season, right? When there's not a lot of like scrims going on, there's not a lot to
yeah.
do except improve.
Have you been in any tryouts so far?
Yeah, so I went to the FlyQuest Combine that they held in October-ish, and then I currently have an AOE tryout lined up next week. And those are like the main two, and then I'll hear about more tryouts kind of as amateur teams start getting their stuff
Yeah,
together.
yeah,
But yeah, those are so the FlyQuest tryout in October was really good, because they had this thing where they bring in trial coaches, so coaches from a bunch of different amateur orgs, and that was exactly what I wanted, right? Different
yeah,
perspectives. And so I went to the trial and I did okay. There are good players there. They're all there for a reason. But the thing I guess I got out of it was, like, I got feedback. And feedback that is valuable, and feedback that is targeting something you hadn't thought about before, is valuable. It's more valuable than gold in this scene, right? Because, like I said, knowledge is difficult to obtain once you get higher and higher.
yeah. And you made also mention of like you cold DM coaches, which is like a
hmm
really, really proactive thing to do, regardless of what position you are in the league scene. I know it was really important for me getting started.
I find that this is something that is weirdly common in the scene, right? Like, I've reached out to professional supports, like Diamond and Zazel in particular. I reached out to them cold, where I just gotten done playing a game with them in solo queue, and I added them, and they're so willing to help. They're so willing to kind of look at my CQ VODs and be like, hey, like, this could have been better, that could have been better. And that's also been an avenue, right? So
Yeah.
I have a bunch of just pro supports added on my list, because everyone's a resource, right?
You did mention also asking people to review your champs Q VODs. How has
hmm
Champions Q been? What did you learn from that experience that might have differed from solo queue?
So I'll start off by saying the obvious, which is that Champions Queue is a lot higher quality than solo queue. But I think the most pertinent thing for me at the beginning was playing with big names. So this is kind of something that no one talks about that I think is important. So as an amateur player, right? Um, you gotta get over this fear of like playing with big names and just being visible. Like I remember the first time I played with T1, 30,000 people. I was choking so hard. This guy was flaming me for 10 minutes straight, and I couldn't play the game because it, if you're just like some average kid who's never interacted with like someone with a following, that's a natural response, and
Yeah.
that's something I had to get over, and I'm continuously getting over. I'm just now starting to get comfortable with the fact that like, yeah, like so what? Let's
Hmm.
just play and see what happens, right? Like, yeah, and so every time I play with T1, I mute him because I just can't do it.
Yep.
But like this is something in CQ where now you're in comms with the guys, and
Yeah.
now they're almost like your peers, and it's like I try to balance it between like seeing what I can learn from them versus having my own opinions, right? Because that's important. Because if you just roll over for every big name in the lobby, you're going to be a shitty player, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I figured out early, right? So in the beginning, when CQ was started popping and I started playing, that was something that I struggled with, which is like, to what extent should I roll over, and to what extent should I just trust in this man who plays the game for a living? His opinion. Should I trust that or go with my own instincts, right?
Yeah.
And so, because oftentimes those differ, they're pinging you like, go here, and you're not really sure why, but sometimes you'll listen.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the struggle for amateur players. And I would argue even like some academy players, right? So then the question is like, well, what should I do about this position that I'm in? Where I'm kind of like, I'm not sure if I'm right. There's uncertainty, and there's a person who's better than me telling me what to do. And I realized that, well, the only way this is going to work is if I just ignore them, because it doesn't matter if I can do what they're saying if I can't generate that idea on my own and reproduce it somewhere else, right? And so that took a lot of like me getting spam pinged and me getting flamed
Yeah.
because I'm doing what I think is right. And they might disagree with that, and they might have good reason to disagree with that. But I figured at the end of the day, like, I'm going to have to make this decision and it might suck. And I'll realize that later in VOD review, right?
Yeah.
And I just have to be okay with that. And for a while, that was really hard on me because it's like, if a person who if a pro player tells you you're bad at doing this certain thing, you're kind of inclined to believe them,
Yeah.
right? So on the one hand, it's like you kind of have to get beaten up a little bit if you want to get better, and that's just something I've accepted, right?
You have gone through years of persevering through UCI, solo queue, champs queue, and just learning constantly. What drives you to be so passionate to keep going?
I think that at the end of the day, it's always been about competition, and so there's nothing that matches the feeling of living up to an expectation within a competitive sense. So like,
Yeah.
I had a tryout where I was versing Ethan, and there's scholarships on the line, right?
Yeah.
There's thousands of dollars at stake. There's clout at stake, right? And so I had that sort of expectation where I was like, I need to perform. And I can think back to a specific play. I don't have it with me, but I can think back to a specific play that I made where it's like it was the make or break point of a game, and I performed. And I remember that feeling, even though it was years ago, because it was like, this is validating. This makes
Hmm.
it worth it. Where it's like, the feeling of yeah, I guess another thing is like the feeling of being really good at something
Yeah.
is intoxicating. Like we kind of lose perspective, right? We're like, oh, if
Yeah.
you're master, you're trash. Oh, if you're GM, you're trash.
Yeah.
It's like all of us that are having this conversation are very like objectively good at the game.
Yeah.
And it's hard to put that down, right? Especially when you're good at it. Especially when you have something that you can continuously work on, right? Because you're never really done improving at League, right?
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. Like the skill ceiling is impossibly high, and it will raise as we deepen our understanding of the game, right? That's been the historical trend
Hmm.
um, since the beginning of the game. And so I think the two things that are really driving me is like, I'm just a person who enjoys improvement. I do it in everything that I do. Everything that I care about enough about to improve in. And League has been one of like those first loves, right?
Yeah.
I care about competition. I care about being good at something, proving my worth at something. All of those things are going into like, why am I pursuing this right now?
Well, that is so awesome. It was such a pleasure to get to talk to you, especially as someone who isn't quite as familiar with you.
Mhm.
Not quite catching you during, PG for an interview and
Right.
whatnot. So I am now really excited to see where you go and really invested. So best of luck.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.